Hello, everybody. I'm Dian Griesel, also known as Silver Disobedience. This is the Silver Disobedience Perception Dynamics podcast. And I have a guest that I've asked to come back because, first of all, let me say you do want to go look at his older episode because it's still in the top 10 amongst fierce competition.
Cool.
And yeah. And why is that? It's John Strausbaugh. And he is considered not the historian of New York, but the biographer of the characters that have made New York the special place that it is. And we're going to be talking about his newest book, Duchamp Takes New York. And
yeah, let's go. Duchamp.
Yeah. And this is going to be fun because if you don't know about anything about Duchamp, I'll just say this. He was the artist and the anti-artist all in one at the turn of the century. So we're going to learn about this from John. Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, I'm
nice
great.
to see you again.
I am so honored you're giving me time again, John, because you're a master at writing and telling stories.
Thank you. Thank you.
So how'd you choose Duchamp for this new book?
I was sitting at a bar with Colin Robinson, who is the publisher of Or Books. It's O-R Books, Or Books. And he and I had worked together a long time ago, 20 odd years ago, on my rock and roll book, Rock Till You Drop. He edited that back in the day. So we were noodling like how to work together again somehow. And he came up with this, with the idea that it might be interesting, a book about somebody who kind of flies into New York and instantly changes New York, and New York changes that person. And I said, well, then we got to do Marcel Duchamp. So that was it.
You know, it was so funny, as I mentioned to you, when your book came in, it's sitting on the counter. My 22-year-old son says, Mom, why is that book on your counter? And I said, well, I have the great opportunity. I'm going to interview the author. And he goes, well, I want it. He goes, you know who he is, right? He says, he's a guy that put a toilet bowl. He goes, in fact, maybe it was a urinal in a museum and called it art.
Yeah, there you are.
Let's talk about his art.
He came into New York at a time when, well, before he even got here, his work came to New York at a time when 1913, in the 1910s, visual arts in America, painting, sculpture, were stuck somewhere in the 1800s, if not the Renaissance. It was very old-fashioned and intentionally so. American artists thought that they were supposed to be preserving the old classical ways. So if you saw a bust of George Washington, it could have been carved in ancient Greece. If you saw a painting, it was a cow standing under a tree that could have been painted hundreds of years ago. And they were completely missing out on what we now know as modern art. Mm-hmm. In Europe, you had Picasso and Van Gogh and Matisse and Brancusi, and all the names we now know of modern art were happening and making things happen over there. Nobody in America, except for a tiny, tiny, like elite of art snobs, had any idea about that work at all. They thought a painting was a cow and a sculpture looked like it was from ancient Greece. And that was art. Some artists in New York in 1913 said, we've got to drag America into the 20th century. So they arranged to bring over this huge, immense exhibition of Picasso and Van Gogh and Matisse and Rodin and all these people that nobody in America had seen before, all at once in one big like art bomb, dropping and exploding in Manhattan in 1 month in 1913. And in that month, the Americans just all of a sudden knew about Impressionism, Expressionism, Cubism. They, so, and painters, American artists and sculptors who like the day before were still painting that cow out under the tree. The next day they're cubists and they're trying to paint like Picasso and Braque and all those guys. So it completely launches New York, which is the art center of America at the time, into the 20th century, into the modern era. And the
What was
one
the
work,
reaction?
it was all over the map. It was 30,000 people in New York went to this art exhibit. Art exhibits before this month, November 1913, in New York, like, 30 people would go. And they were all like people, they were collectors and people who already knew what they were going to go see. 30,000 people saw it. And then it toured to Boston and I think Chicago, and another 40,000 people saw it. So this was an art exhibit that 70,000 people saw. Nothing remotely like that had ever happened in America. And they were seeing work that had never happened in America. So it was a huge deal. All the newspapers, all the magazines commented on it. Some people hated it. A lot of people thought it was ridiculous. All the work was ridiculous. Matisse's Blue Nude, they just hated because it didn't look like a nude is supposed to look. And they thought it was ugly and hideous. And why was he painting her to look so awful? But the one work out of the whole show that everybody keyed on, everybody in New York keyed on as representing it all, it was almost 1,500 works. The one was by this guy, also nobody had ever heard of, but even in Europe, nobody had ever heard of him. He's a 25-year-old Frenchman named Marcel Duchamp, and it was that painting, Nude Descending, a Staircase, number 2. It's that one that looks like a robot kind of clanking down stairs. At the time, people were like, what is this? Is he joking? They thought maybe it was. So some people were abused, some people were outraged by it, but people wrote poems about it. Everybody knew that one painting. That was the one work out of that show that everybody knew. He is back in Paris studying to be a librarian. He had no idea of the impact he was having. But because of him and Picasso and Braque and all those other guys, American art went to bed one kind of art and woke up the next morning modern art. So it was a huge.
Based on your research, John, what do you think it was that stood out about that piece with all those other, clear talent as well?
People have tried to figure that out ever since. I personally think that it struck people, Americans as New Yorkers, as funny, as a joke. They really thought that he was kidding around, and which is totally appropriate for Duchamp because he had a big sense of humor, and a lot of his work is like, Groucho Marx was making these paintings. So they did get it. New York, the same way I compared to the way, not that much, a few decades before, New Yorkers understood what P.T. Barnum was up to more than we do now. Now we think of him as that guy who fooled Americans, with his hoaxes. They knew they were being hoaxed. People loved hoaxes in the 19th century. It was a very popular form of entertainment because you tried to figure out, the Fiji mermaid that's got the head of a monkey and the tail of a fish. Well, how did he do that? You knew it was fake. You weren't fooled by it. We think they were fooled by Barnum. He never fooled anybody. He entertained them. I think there was the same sort of spirit with Duchamp. It was the one work in the show that they could look at and say, yeah, he's pulling my leg here. What is it? What this thing coming down these stairs? They had people called it all. They had all sorts of nicknames for it. It amused them. And I think that's what really struck them and made it stand out from all the other work, a lot of which was actually, that's pretty serious.
It's such an interesting point you make about the illusion and, kind of knowing you're tricked and magic. And, I just this past week, some article I read was discussing that Banksy, artist, has been revealed and how upset it's made people. And, there's a lot about mystery. I truly know I hate to go to a magic show when the person sitting next to me is saying, well, I know how that's done. I'm like, I turn to them. I'm just like, it's magic. Leave it there. It's magic.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point. I think to a certain extent, Duchamp was magical to people in New York in 1913. They had seen nothing like anything in the show, but that's the one that just worked for them and amused them and entertained them. And I think a lot of the rest of the work just people didn't get it and didn't know what they were looking at. But that one struck them funny and entertained them.
Now, he's got this sudden fame. He's in this huge art show. 30,000 people have come to see it in New York, of all places.
Yeah.
And does he move back to New York?
He finally, 2 years later, he finally comes to New York. He comes really to get away from Paris in World War I. World War I starts in 1914. He tried to sign up for the military, but he had a congestive heart thing. So he was rejected by the military. If you were a young man, he was like 26 at that point. Walking around in Paris and not in a uniform. People were spitting on you and being, and he was like, I just can't deal with this. So he escaped. He's been called an escape artist, and he did a number of times in his life. You see him escaping from situations he's not happy about. And that's one of the first big ones. He escapes from Paris. He knew a guy in New York. He comes to New York, and he's immediately a celebrity because he's the guy who did that painting 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. There are headlines that say, "The nude descending a staircase guy arrives." They practically had a band out on the pier when he showed up. And he, of course, he's loving it. Nobody in Europe, he was nobody. That painting had been rejected from a show in Paris. So he's nobody. He's less than nobody. He's been rejected. He's a reject in Paris. He comes to New York and everyone's like, "That's that guy. Hey, hey, hey." Everybody wants to know him. Everybody wants to take him out to dinner and buy him drinks and write articles about him. There was like a press
frenzy.
Yeah, a frenzy, like, the 1915 version of a press frenzy. But still, a lot of magazines and newspapers were writing about him. And he said, "Oh, I like this." So he stuck around, started making good friends in the arts community, because by the time he shows up 2 years after that big show, all the artists in New York are trying to be modern artists. So Duchamp has arrived. So they want to hang around with Duchamp and figure out how to be modern artists. And Man Ray, who became one of his best friends, before the show, he was painting the cow under the tree. He sees the show, he starts trying to be Cubist. He meets Duchamp, and he starts being very much a Duchampian sort of artist. Mm-hmm. From that. A lot of his work looks almost like Duchamp could have done it for him. Mm-hmm. So he's already had an impact in New York before he gets there. And then when he gets there, he starts personally having a personal influence on the generation of artists in New York at the time, and being friends with them all, and hanging out with them all, and sleeping with all the females, and just enjoying himself, smoking his cigars and his pipes and loving it. But meanwhile, he's challenging the whole idea of what art is, and this kind of starts when that painting of his, when the Nude Descending a Staircase was rejected in Paris from a Cubist show. These are supposed to be like avant-garde, very forward-thinking artists in Paris, and they were like, I don't know. That's not what a nude is supposed to look like. They were as backward in that sense as anybody in America at the time was. And he said, and they were like, "Can you change it?" And he just went and took it and left. And from then on, he was suspicious of art groups in general, and art, and the whole idea of making art. And he begins questioning art in some really serious ways. Mm-hmm. He pretty soon he's doing things like he's gluing string to a piece of paper, and he's saying, "That's art. It's art because I said it's art." And nobody had thought about art that way before. Nobody had questioned what art was. If you said to people, "What is art?" they all assumed they knew the answer. It was the painting of the cow. It was the statue that looked like a Greek statue. That was art. And he was saying, "Well, why isn't this piece of string art?" And they had never thought about that. And that angered the heck out of an awful lot of art scholars at the time and art critics, because they knew exactly what art was, and that wasn't art. And he was saying, "Well, tell me why not?" And they kind of couldn't.
It is a fascinating debate. I mean, if you look at a Michelangelo sculpture,
yeah,
And then you look at a block.
Yeah.
Someone sits out someplace and maybe it's got another block on top of it, and that's called art.
Yeah.
And the people buy for a lot of money. It almost gets
Yeah.
down to that illusion of what you want to believe,
See,
as
there
you
you go.
mentioned earlier.
And a lot of that starts with Duchamp and some of his contemporaries. But in New York, it's really Duchamp who brings that notion. He brings it to America. The
So is
question,
it art or is it a good trickster?
he's both. He called himself an anartist, like an anarchist,
Yeah.
anarchist. But I definitely, there's one great photo of him that Man Ray took. Man Ray took most of his best photos, where they took a bunch of shaving soap and they like did his hair up into horns, and he looks like the devil. And I think that portrait says more about him than a lot of his more straightforward portraits. He had a devilish sense of humor about it. He was a trickster. And I really think it came because when he was a young man starting out, he had been rejected by art. And so he from then on for the rest of his career, he's rejecting art and questioning art. He thought paintings, he said all paintings were just retinal. They were just there, like retinal, like they were just, all they did was amuse the eye. He said, they don't make you think about anything. Art should make you think about something. So he started doing very cerebral, a lot of his work. He's the first conceptual artist, that's for sure. Decades before anybody was doing work that was considered conceptual art. He was the first minimalist, well before.
Conceptual art. How do you find conceptual art?
There was that point, I guess it was in the 1970s and 80s, where you'd walk into an art gallery and there was nothing in the room. It was just a completely blank room. And they would say, well, yeah, that's you have to think about it. That's my piece of art. It's called, and it would be called something cerebral and be called like, emptiness.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are like, well, how is that art? Well, he started raising that point 50 years earlier. So
I wonder how they're paying the rent in those spaces. Especially in New York. Wait a second, I just walked into a show that has nothing in it. How are they paying the rent for this space?
Like, how did they charge? I went in, I saw some of that kind of work. There would be like a piece of string on the floor, and that was that whole exhibition was that piece of string. And then you were supposed to think about the room around you. There was a really nice one I saw once that was just, there was a window high up in the wall, and it was just, you were just supposed to watch the light pass as the sun passed overhead. You watched that ray of light go across the room and say, oh, all right, okay, all right, I get it. But I don't know how the gallery owner sold that to anybody. So you raise a really good point. And Duchamp's work never sold very well in his lifetime. Now, of course, it sells for a whole lot of money. But in those days, people didn't know what they were. I mean, they bought it, but they didn't pay a lot for it because they weren't quite sure it was art yet.
What do you think that is that makes people collect? Collectors in the aftermath or the post life?
Well, I knew a gallerist who said to me years and years and years ago, artists really become valuable when they're dead.
Yeah.
Because they're not making any more art. So there's only 50 paintings or 20 sculptures or 110, even Picasso, who just cranked it out. When he died, then that was it. He wasn't cranking out any more work anymore. It instantly becomes more valuable. I knew a guy who died pretty young, who had been, he was doing all right as an artist, but all of a sudden, as a dead artist, now they spend a lot of money for his work. The work didn't change.
Concept.
Yeah, the work's no different.
Makes sense, but it's
a limited edition now.
Limited edition that you don't get the benefit from while you're alive. Wow.
No.
Wow. That's something.
I always say to my artist friends, wait till you're dead. You'll be famous then.
Huh. So what do you think it is? You're a biographer of New York City. What do you think it is that brings the the Duchamps,
Yeah.
brings these guys to New York and makes the public receptive to it?
Yep. It's a really good question. I've written about it a lot in various ways. If you look at like the whole history of world culture in the 20th century specifically, everybody who was anybody in world culture at least passed through New York intentionally, came to New York to see what was going on. And a whole lot of them came and stayed for a few years or for the rest of their lives. It was the busiest, most active, in some ways most forward, even though it was so backward about some things. Everywhere else was way more backward. So it was backward, but not as backward as if you were, I won't say, in the Midwest, but in the Midwest, or in Europe, and a lot of places in Europe. I mean, modern artists all flocked to Paris in Europe because you kind of didn't want to be anywhere else at that point in time. New York, you had Greenwich Village, which was, the art center for all the arts, not just painting and sculpture, but for writers and musicians and dancers and singers and actors for decades. It lasted much longer than those kind of arty neighborhoods usually last. They usually last a little while, and then people start moving in and wanting to be near all the artists and spending a lot more money to be there than the artists themselves can afford. So the artists got to move out to make room for all the newcomers, which has happened now in Greenwich Village. Greenwich Village is not an arty neighborhood anymore. It hasn't been for 40, 50 years now. But it was, and it was for a long time. So that was important. There was where Lincoln Center eventually was built, with that neighborhood that up there was another arty neighborhood, and there were lots of ateliers, and people were painting and sculpting and making music and all the other arts. The Lower East Side was happening in a different sort of way at the time. So there was a lot happening here. It was a giant city compared to all the other cities in America and for a long time in the world. It was giant. So there was room for everything. And there were people, you could bump into people and do anything. So there was that sense of freedom and excitement here that just, you weren't going to get that in Paris. Paris was, sedate and it's, yeah, it was Paris. It was the same Paris we know today. Rome was the same Rome we know today. New York City then is not the same as New York City now. New York City is always changing, always moving somewhere, not always in the right direction, but that's all right. So that just made it a magnet for people who in here were moving somewhere. They were thinking, they were writing, they were dancing, so they all came here. Everybody came here in the 20th century. It's not so much a magnet now.
Now, when Duchamp arrived, did the authors, the poets, the other hipsters gravitate?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They all took him around for drinks and dinner and showed him the French cafes in the village and where to go downtown, and they took him around. He was celebrated. He was loved. He was feted everywhere he went. He made some really good friends in the arts, including Florine Stettheimer. Florine's not as well known as she should be, and the fact that she's known at all is because she was Duchamp's friend, and he really made sure that he lent her some of his celebrity so that people knew about her work. Great painter, but it's almost like outsider art. It's very naive looking. It's been called like purposefully naive. She did it on purpose, but you can't tell that if you're just looking at the painting. It looks a bit childish and a little silly, but you got to study him for a while, and then there's a lot of depth to her work. And he gave her that much attention to study the work and get it.
What you have chronicled so much of New York as far as the people here, and you pick such interesting personalities. And what do you think it is about a personality that starts to get that rise in New York? Like the genuine rise, not the Instagram famous for a moment, I'm an influencer, fly over here, over there. I mean that that influence where you're moving people. Maybe you're not making money, as we pointed out, that the artist doesn't always make money, but they're moving the people. They're getting the people to gravitate towards them. People want to be around that person. What do you think those characteristics are that you've, formed and observed through all your writing and character study?
I do think probably the biggest factor is their individuality. They're individuals, the ones, the poets, the painters, the whoever, just the hipsters, the people who are just hip or cool. They are all individuals in New York City. And New York City, especially through the 20th century, well, no, even in the 19th century, not only allowed you to be an individual in ways that you kind of weren't allowed in Boston or in Baltimore or in Kansas City. You were supposed to be more part of the group. Here, you were supposed to be yourself. And be yourself as big as you wanted to be, and be as smart as you wanted. Smart was kind of looked down on in a lot of other places in America at the time. You could be as talented as you wanted to be, and you could express it as freely and as large and as aggressively as you want to. And I think that's still true in New York to this day. We like big, aggressive individuals. For better or worse. We've created some terrible ones, as we know. One of them's running the world now. But also a lot of great ones. And as you say, they're not always like super popular. They're often not getting rich being who they are, but they're getting to be who they are. And they're getting to do what they want to do. And that's, I think, New York has, for maybe forever, but certainly since the 19th century, freed you up to be that person, be who you are. So it attracts people who are feeling like they can't be who they are anywhere else.
You describe that way. And if I was going to say the biggest shift, I mean, when I think of moving to New York in the mid 80s, my fascination was the people. The over-the-size personalities, the people that were just there. But the key was, it was unapologetically. They were just who they were, and they didn't ask you to approve it. They didn't ask you to sign off on it. They didn't ask you to acknowledge it. It's just, here I am, darling, and I'm lovely, and and I'm going to have a great time whether you want it or not. Want to join me or not. It was just that craziness. And nobody was looking for a sign off by anybody else.
No, it's true.
Which is a very different shift today in some ways in culture. And I'm really hoping we get back to that, just be who you are. And, it starts with you saying, I'm okay. And I don't need you to sign off on it. I'm not asking you to give me the approval I understand some of that in society has to happen, maybe for job fairness and things like that. But, whoa, we need that vibe of, boom.
We're missing it. When I wrote the history of Greenwich Village, an awful lot of the people I interviewed, thank you very much, a lot of the people, especially the older ones that I interviewed who had come in the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, to New York City from everywhere else around the world. That was what they said, I couldn't be who I am in wherever they had grown up and lived. The people would just not have weren't allowing me to be who I am. And then I heard about this magical place called Greenwich Village in New York City, where you were not only allowed to be who you were supposed to be who you were, and you were
exactly.
Yes, be who you are. And I think that's a huge reason New York was such a magnet back in the day. And we've lost that in a lot of ways. And it's why it's not as much of a magnet as it used to be.
Yeah, I think we really I always feel hope when I see with, our kids, when they're doing that feisty things that 20-something-year-olds should do, bringing that personality, as they used to say, the resistance to the man, bring it on,
And
don't be the spokesperson for the man, resist the man.
I feel like I'm too old to criticize them anymore because I don't really know what they're up to. I've lost touch. I'm out of touch. I'm stuck back in history. I'm writing about history all the time. So, I mean, there may be a lot of stuff going on that I don't know about. And
Yeah.
good for you. Go for it.
But
Because
you're stuck in history is such an interesting phrase, because one of the things, I mean, history is incredibly important. It's so
well,
important.
yeah,
And
okay.
and you're taking history from such an interesting perspective of the people in it, not just, the event at large, the
Right.
individual within those events, those time periods, the essence of the big picture. It's really cool what you focus on in your writing.
Thank you. I think that history is it's human endeavor, it's human nature
Hmm.
that already. The only difference is it's not happening now; it happened then. But it's human nature. It's about the human beings who did it. So I've always been much more interested in the people who were around in the Civil War than the big grand scale battles and stuff like that. I'm not. That's history too, and there are people who can make that very interesting. But it's not what I do. I'm much more interested in the individuals and how they got up in the morning and why they did what they did and who they were. That I think that's there's the Bayeux tapestry, that big tapestry of 1066. But if you're looking at it, it's like all these individuals. It's this guy and the king and that, to me, that's a pretty good way of telling the stories that end up being called history.
And it's interesting you say that, because it's funny, when I walk down the streets of New York, and my favorite part of my day is when I just go take a walk. I'll do it randomly, and picking up on the conversations, observing people. And I'm always walking around saying every single person I'm passing has a story.
Yep.
Endlessly captivates me that each person has some story that I don't know. They're dealing with something, they're excited about something, they're sad about something. And
Yeah.
that's really cool in your books, that tapping into the personalities.
I think that's if I was writing in some other city, maybe I wouldn't be as interested in that. But in New York City, I really do believe that's what has always made New York, the individuals, the people, and the way they bounce off each other and interact with each other. That's New
You
York.
have this amazing new book out,
Yeah.
adding to your collective
This
of
one? You talking about this?
that one, yeah. Adding to your collective of many great books, not to be that, that corporate slave driver, but who's going to be next? Who's the next one you're thinking about? Because I know there's at least one person you're percolating at the moment.
I am.
Share?
I have a couple different ideas. I don't want to say one because somebody will steal it, but
Okay.
the other would be harder to steal. I've always been really interested and done some writing about Victoria Woodhull. She was the first woman to run for president, like 50 years before women could even vote. Here in New York City, another one. She came to New York City because nowhere else was big enough or capable of handling her. This in the 1870s, so we're talking a while ago. And she turned like Duchamp and like some of the other great characters in New York history, she turned the city upside down and inside out, just being an enormous character herself. And first woman on Wall Street, first woman to run for president, but also kind of a sex worker and a con artist. And she's very complicated and interesting person. Spent the election night when she ran for president in jail. So, great guy. She's been written about a lot, but I wouldn't mind doing a book this size about her impact on New York City and New York City, the way New York City. We haven't really mentioned this, but the way New York City kind of liberated Victoria Woodhull to be Victoria Woodhull, the same way it did for Duchamp to be Duchamp, and for you and I to be who we are. New York liberates individuals and energizes them and enables them. Now, what you do with that is up to you. What she did with it was not all good stuff. Some of it was bad stuff. But she's fascinating, and I'd love to do her. And some other people, but her next, maybe. Maybe.
Oh my gosh, John, these interviews go too fast. And I so very much enjoy speaking with you and hearing about all you're doing, because you pick such fascinating characters.
They're out
I
there.
love that you're a fan of New York, because so am I, no matter what anybody says. And,
Exactly.
and you're keeping it all alive and well.
Thank you very much. So are you. Here we are.
Well, thank you. Everybody, there are going to be all kinds of links to John Strausbaugh. Yes, there you go. Go ahead, hold it up. There's going to be all kinds of links to that book, as well as, you know, John's page where you can find some of his other books. Because let me tell you,
great.
there's some really good ones, and I highly recommend you check them out. He's got, you know, stuff about Greenwich Village. He's got things about, I believe it was World War II. You know, that was post World War II, or
Both.
during. Okay. You know, you've really written on some fascinating topics, and they always zoom in on the people that really give you a pulse to the city. So, John, we're going to be moving over to the green room. Stay on. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me, Diane.
And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I'm Dian Griesel. This is the Silver Disobedience Perception Dynamics podcast. Hit subscribe. That would be a really good idea. Come back, share this with your friends, and make sure you check out all the links below to learn more about John and get some copies of his books. Guaranteed great gifts for yourself and others. Wonderful reading. Thanks.
Thank you.